Imagine floating 250 miles above Earth. The sun has just slipped behind the planet, and in an instant, the world outside your window transforms into the deepest, most absolute darkness you have ever known. No streetlights, no horizon glow, just an infinite black canvas punctuated by stars so sharp and so still, they almost feel alive. You press your face against the cold glass of the cupola, the International Space Station's panoramic observation module, and for a moment, everything is silent. Everything is still. And then, right at the edge of your vision, something moves. This is not science fiction. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the lived experience reported by men and women who have spent months aboard the International Space Station, some of the most rigorously trained and psychologically screened human beings on the planet. And what they describe, quietly, carefully, sometimes only years after returning to Earth, has been given an informal name among those who have lived and worked in low Earth orbit. They call them the Watchers. Now, before you scroll away or assume this is another sensationalized tale of aliens lurking behind the moon, I want you to stay with me. Because this story is far more nuanced, far more scientifically grounded, and ultimately far more fascinating than any tabloid headline could ever capture. This is a story about what happens to human perception at the edge of our world. It is a story about light, about physics, about the fragile architecture of the human brain operating in an environment it was never designed for. And it is a story about why one of the most transparent scientific organizations in history has remained remarkably quiet about a set of experiences that dozens of astronauts have confirmed. Let us start at the beginning. Not with the International Space Station, but with a man named John Glenn and a flight that changed everything. On February 20th, 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth aboard Friendship 7. The mission was a triumph, a defining moment in the space race. But something happened during that flight that Glenn had not expected, and that mission control could not immediately explain. As his capsule passed into the shadow of Earth on his first orbit, Glenn looked out the window and saw thousands of tiny luminous particles drifting past his spacecraft. They glowed. They swirled. They moved with what seemed like quiet intention. Glenn, a combat veteran and test pilot not prone to fantasy, described them as fireflies. His voice on the communication loop was calm but unmistakably fascinated. He had never seen anything like it. The world listened. Headlines ran wild. Were these living organisms? Some unknown space phenomenon no one had predicted? The answer, as it turned out, came on the very next Mercury mission when astronaut Scott Carpenter discovered that the particles were tiny flakes of frost breaking away from the exterior of the spacecraft, illuminated by sunlight as they drifted into the void. Mystery solved. Science had done what science does. It observed, it questioned, and it explained. But here is what is often left out of that tidy narrative. Even after the explanation, Glenn himself acknowledged that seeing those particles, that moment of genuine uncertainty in the absolute silence of orbit, changed something in him. It was not about the frost. It was about the realization that space could present you with experiences your mind was simply not equipped to categorize. And that feeling, that sense of encountering something just beyond the edge of understanding, would go on to be described by astronaut after astronaut in the decades that followed. Fast forward to the 1970s and the Apollo program. During the translunar coast, the long, quiet journey between Earth and the Moon, astronauts began reporting something deeply strange. When they closed their eyes to sleep, they saw flashes of light. Not metaphorical flashes, not dreams. Actual streaks and points of white light appearing behind their closed eyelids, sometimes as bright pinpricks, sometimes as luminous trails that cut across their visual field like tiny shooting stars firing off inside their own skulls. At first, these reports were met with cautious interest. Were the astronauts simply exhausted? Was this some kind of optical illusion caused by the immense stress of spaceflight? NASA took the question seriously enough to design a dedicated experiment. During Apollo 11, and then more extensively during Apollo 14 and 15, astronauts wore specialized helmets equipped with particle detectors while they attempted to sleep. The results confirmed what physicists had suspected. The flashes were real. And they were caused by heavy cosmic ray nuclei, high-energy particles from deep space that travel at nearly the speed of light. These particles, known as HZE ions, were passing directly through the spacecraft hull and through the astronauts' bodies. When one of these particles struck the retina or the visual cortex of the brain, it triggered a neural response identical to the experience of seeing light. The astronauts were literally seeing cosmic rays with their own nervous systems. This was a landmark finding, and it opened up an entirely new field of research into the effects of space radiation on human perception. But it also revealed something quietly unsettling. If cosmic rays could stimulate the visual system directly, bypassing the eyes entirely in some cases, then the boundary between what astronauts were truly seeing out there and what their brains were generating internally was far less clear than anyone had comfortably assumed. The human visual system, so reliable here on Earth where it evolved over millions of years, was suddenly operating in a regime it had never encountered before. And it was improvising. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle because when we talk about what astronauts experience on the International Space Station today, we are not talking about people who are imagining things or making stories up. We are talking about highly trained scientific observers whose sensory systems are being subjected to conditions that fundamentally alter how perception works. The station orbits Earth at roughly 17,500 miles per hour, completing a full lap every 90 minutes. That means the crew experiences 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets every single day. The constant, relentless cycling between intense, unfiltered sunlight and absolute pitch-black darkness. The persistent exposure to cosmic radiation far beyond anything encountered on Earth's surface. The microgravity environment that shifts fluid distribution throughout the body, changes intracranial pressure, and even reshapes the eyeball itself. All of these factors converge to create a perceptual landscape unlike anything found anywhere on our planet. And in that landscape, astronauts see things. They see things they can explain and things they cannot. They see ice crystals catching sunlight and briefly blazing like distant stars. They see fragments of space debris tumbling silently past the station's windows, some of them meticulously tracked by ground control, and some of them appearing from nowhere and vanishing just as quickly. They see the aurora borealis from above, a shimmering green and violet curtain draped across the polar regions, and they describe it as one of the most profoundly moving sights a human being can ever witness. But occasionally, they also see things that do not fit neatly into any of these familiar categories. Objects or lights that move in ways inconsistent with known debris trajectories. Phenomena that appear and vanish within seconds, too brief for the station's external cameras to capture in any meaningful detail, too fleeting to report with any confidence. And this is where the silence begins. This is where the story of the Watchers truly starts to take shape. Because what happens when an astronaut, someone who has dedicated their entire career to science and exploration, sees something they genuinely cannot explain? What happens when the institution they represent, an institution built on empirical evidence and peer-reviewed certainty, does not have a ready-made framework to address what they experienced? The answer, as many astronauts have suggested in interviews and memoirs and quiet conversations over the years, is that you simply do not talk about it. Not because anyone orders you to stay silent. Not because there is some shadowy conspiracy operating behind closed doors. But because the culture of spaceflight, a culture built on precision and data and repeatable, verifiable results, does not have a comfortable place for the unexplained. There is no checkbox on a mission report for something that made you feel watched. And yet the unexplained persists. It lingers in the margins of mission logs and in the quiet personal reflections of those who have returned from orbit fundamentally changed. It lives in a phenomenon that psychologists and philosophers have studied for decades, something that may hold the key to understanding why the experience of space produces feelings so many astronauts struggle to put into words. It is called the overview effect, and it may be one of the most important psychological discoveries of the entire space age. The overview effect. It is a term coined by author and space philosopher Frank White in 1987, but the experience itself had been described by astronauts for decades before anyone gave it a name. In its simplest form, the overview effect is a profound cognitive shift that occurs when a human being sees Earth from space for the first time. It is not merely the appreciation of a beautiful view. It is something deeper, something almost neurological, a sudden and overwhelming awareness that every war, every border, every division you have ever known exists on a single fragile sphere hanging in the void, protected by nothing more than a tissue-thin atmosphere glowing blue against the black. Nearly every astronaut who has spoken publicly about their experience in orbit has referenced some version of this feeling. Some describe it as instant and overwhelming. Others say it crept in slowly, orbit after orbit, sunrise after sunrise, until one day they looked down at the Earth and realized they were weeping and could not explain why. Ron Garan, a NASA astronaut who flew to the International Space Station in 2011, described it as seeing the world without borders, without conflict, without separation, and realizing in a single moment that the thin blue line of atmosphere was all that stood between every living thing he had ever known and the utter hostility of the vacuum. He called it a sobering, humbling, and ultimately transformative experience. Nicole Stott, who spent over 100 days in orbit across 2 missions, has spoken extensively about how the overview effect rewired her understanding of life on Earth. She has described looking down at the planet and feeling not distance but connection, an almost spiritual sense of unity with every human being, every ecosystem, every breath of wind moving across the surface below. These are not fringe accounts from people seeking attention. These are the words of engineers, scientists, physicians, and military pilots, people who were selected for spaceflight specifically because of their emotional stability and rational thinking. And when you listen to enough of them, a pattern begins to emerge. The overview effect is not just a feeling. It is a perceptual reorganization. The brain, confronted with a perspective it never evolved to process, begins to interpret reality differently. And for some astronauts, that reorganization extends beyond the philosophical. It reaches into the sensory. This is where the science becomes genuinely fascinating and where the idea of the watchers begins to make a different kind of sense. Because when researchers at institutions like the University of Houston and the University of Pennsylvania began studying the effects of long-duration spaceflight on the human brain, what they found was remarkable. The brain does not simply maintain its Earth-based settings when placed in microgravity. It adapts, and sometimes those adaptations produce unexpected results. In microgravity, the fluid that normally pools in your lower body due to gravity redistributes evenly throughout your frame. Your face puffs up, your sinuses swell, and crucially, the pressure inside your skull changes. This shift in intracranial pressure has been directly linked to a condition NASA now formally calls Spaceflight-Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, or SANS. The back of the eyeball can flatten. The optic nerve can swell. Some astronauts return to Earth with measurably degraded vision that takes months to recover, and in a few cases, never fully returns to its pre-flight baseline. But degraded vision is only the most obvious symptom. Researchers have noted that altered intracranial pressure can affect how the brain processes visual information at a deeper level. The visual cortex, that region at the back of your brain responsible for constructing the images you perceive as reality, is exquisitely sensitive to changes in pressure, blood flow, and neural chemistry. In an environment where all 3 of those variables have shifted, the brain's image construction process becomes subtly unreliable. Not broken, not hallucinating in any clinical sense, but operating at the very edge of its design parameters, filling in gaps, interpreting ambiguous stimuli, creating coherent images from incomplete data, which is exactly what your brain does every single second of every day here on Earth. You just never notice it because the environment is familiar. In space, the environment is anything but. And then there is the isolation. Not merely physical isolation, although the station is, by definition, the most remote human outpost in existence, but perceptual isolation. On Earth, your senses are constantly bombarded with information. Traffic noise, birdsong, the feeling of wind on your skin, the smell of rain, the subtle vibrations of a world teeming with life beneath your feet. On the International Space Station, the dominant sound is the relentless hum of fans and air recyclers. The dominant visual experience when you are not conducting experiments or maintenance is the stark binary of blinding sunlight and absolute darkness cycling past your window every 45 minutes. The dominant physical sensation is the eerie, persistent weightlessness that never stops, not even while you sleep, strapped into a bag on a wall so you do not drift into equipment. Psychologists have known for decades that sensory deprivation, even mild forms of it, can dramatically alter perception. In classic isolation tank experiments conducted as far back as the 1950s by researchers like John C. Lilly, subjects deprived of normal sensory input for extended periods consistently reported vivid visual and auditory experiences, not because they were losing their minds, but because the brain, starved of external data, begins generating its own. It fills the silence with sound. It fills the darkness with light. It creates patterns where none exist because pattern recognition is the brain's most fundamental survival tool, and it does not simply switch off when there is nothing to see. Now imagine that tendency, that deeply hardwired neurological impulse to find patterns and meaning in ambiguous stimuli, operating inside a human being who is simultaneously experiencing cosmic ray flashes behind their eyelids, altered intracranial pressure reshaping their visual processing, and a view out the window that alternates between the most beautiful thing they have ever seen and the most terrifying void they could ever imagine. Suddenly, the idea that astronauts occasionally perceive presences, shapes, or movements that they cannot fully explain becomes not mysterious but almost predictable. The brain is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is watching for threats. It is scanning for meaning. It is constructing a coherent narrative out of an environment that offers very little coherent data to work with. And sometimes the narrative it constructs includes the feeling that something out there is watching back. This is what the watchers most likely are. Not alien entities, not government secrets, but a profound and deeply human neurological response to an environment that pushes our perceptual systems to their absolute limits. And that, I would argue, is not a less interesting explanation than the supernatural. It is a far more interesting one, because it tells us something fundamental about who we are and how we experience reality. But let us be honest about something else. Let us talk about the silence, because the silence is real, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms. NASA has never formally addressed the informal concept of the Watchers. There is no press release debunking it. There is no official statement confirming it. And that absence of comment has, predictably, been interpreted by some as evidence of concealment. But the reality is both simpler and more complicated than a cover-up. NASA is an organization that operates under extraordinary public scrutiny. Every statement it makes is parsed, amplified, and sometimes distorted by a global media ecosystem that thrives on sensation. When astronaut Leland Melvin was asked in a social media exchange about whether he had ever seen anything unusual in space, he mentioned observing something organic-looking floating out of the payload bay during a shuttle mission. He quickly clarified that it could have been ice or a piece of thermal blanket, and NASA ground control at the time suggested it was likely space debris. But the exchange went viral, stripped of its nuance, repackaged as proof that NASA was hiding alien encounters. And this is precisely the problem. For an agency that depends on public trust and government funding, any engagement with ambiguous phenomena carries enormous institutional risk. Not because the phenomena are not real, but because the conversation around them is almost impossible to control. This is not unique to NASA. The European Space Agency, Roscosmos, JAXA, and every other space organization in the world faces the same dilemma. When astronauts report something they cannot immediately explain, the institutional response is almost always to investigate quietly, determine a prosaic cause if one exists, and move on. Not because curiosity is being suppressed, but because the gap between what an astronaut personally experiences and what can be scientifically verified and publicly communicated is vast, and the consequences of filling that gap irresponsibly are severe. It is also worth noting that NASA has, in recent years, become significantly more open about phenomena that were once considered too sensitive for public discussion. In 2022, NASA appointed Mark McInerney as the agency's first director of UAP research, signaling a formal willingness to investigate unidentified anomalous phenomena with scientific rigor. The agency held its first public meeting on UAPs in 2023, and the independent study team NASA convened recommended that the agency take a leading role in collecting and analyzing data on objects and events in Earth's atmosphere and near-Earth space that cannot be immediately identified. This was a meaningful shift, not toward confirming any particular explanation, but toward acknowledging that unexplained observations deserve systematic scientific attention rather than reflexive dismissal. And within that shift, there is space, perhaps for the first time, for the experiences astronauts have quietly carried for decades to be examined openly. Not as evidence of extraterrestrial contact, but as valuable data about the limits and capabilities of human perception in space. Because as we prepare to send human beings to the moon again through the Artemis program, and eventually to Mars, understanding how the human brain responds to the extreme environment of space is not an academic curiosity. It is a mission-critical priority. Consider what a journey to Mars will look like. 6 to 9 months of transit in a spacecraft far smaller than the International Space Station. No resupply missions. No quick abort back to Earth. A crew of 4 to 6 people sealed inside a metal cylinder, exposed to galactic cosmic radiation at levels significantly higher than anything experienced on the ISS, which at least benefits from partial shielding by Earth's magnetosphere. The psychological and perceptual challenges of that journey will be unlike anything any human has ever endured. And if we do not understand what space does to the mind, if we do not take seriously the full range of experiences astronauts report, including the ones that do not fit neatly into existing categories, then we are sending people on a journey we have not adequately prepared them for. This is why the story of the Watchers matters. Not because it proves that something supernatural is happening in low Earth orbit, but because it reveals how much we still have to learn about the most complex object in the known universe, the human brain, and how it behaves when removed from the only world it has ever known. And that brings us to a question that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. A question that does not have a clean answer, and maybe is more powerful because of that. What does it mean that we are a species capable of building a structure that orbits our planet at 17,500 miles per hour? A structure where human beings live and work for months at a time, conducting experiments that push the boundaries of biology, physics, and medicine. And yet we still do not fully understand what happens inside our own minds when we look out the window. What does it say about us that we can map the cosmic microwave background radiation, the faint afterglow of the Big Bang itself, with exquisite precision, and yet we cannot definitively explain why a person floating in the cupola of the ISS at 3 in the morning occasionally feels a presence in the darkness that is not there? Maybe it says that the universe is larger than our instruments. Maybe it says that consciousness itself, this strange, luminous, still barely understood phenomenon that allows you to hear these words and feel something in response, is the deepest frontier we have yet to explore. The astronauts who have spoken about the Watchers, who have described that quiet, persistent sense that the darkness outside their window is not empty, are not reporting a failure of rationality. They are reporting the experience of a human mind confronting the infinite and doing the only thing it knows how to do, reaching for meaning. And that impulse, the impulse to look into the void and search for something looking back, is not a weakness. It is arguably the very quality that drove us to build rockets in the first place. Every telescope we have ever pointed at the sky, every rover we have landed on another world, every radio signal we have beamed into the cosmos hoping for a reply, is an expression of the same fundamental need. We do not just want to explore the universe. We want to know if the universe is aware of us. So far, the scientific evidence tells us that the phenomena astronauts experience in orbit, the lights, the movements, the presences, the feeling of being watched, can be explained through a combination of cosmic ray interactions, fluid shift-related visual changes, the neurological effects of isolation and sensory deprivation, and the profound cognitive reorganization triggered by the overview effect. These explanations are not dismissive. They are extraordinary in their own right. They reveal that the human brain is so determined to make sense of its environment, so relentlessly committed to constructing a coherent reality, that even in the most alien setting imaginable, it keeps working, keeps interpreting, keeps watching. But the explanations do not close the door on wonder. They open it wider. Because every answer in science leads to a deeper question. And the deeper question here is one that has fascinated philosophers, physicists, and dreamers for centuries. Is consciousness something that arises solely within our skulls, a byproduct of electrochemical activity in a 3-pound organ? Or is it something more fundamental, something woven into the fabric of the universe itself? Something that space, in its vastness and silence, might reveal to us if we are patient enough to listen. We do not know. Not yet. And I think there is a rare kind of honesty in admitting that. In a world saturated with people who claim certainty about things they cannot possibly know, there is something valuable, something even beautiful, about standing at the edge of knowledge and saying, "We are still looking." The astronauts who floated in the cupola and felt the watchers were not seeing aliens. They were seeing the universe through the most sensitive instrument ever created, the human mind, pushed to its very limits. And what they brought back, more than data, more than photographs, more than samples of bone density loss or fluid dynamics in microgravity, was a reminder. A reminder that we are still at the very beginning, that every orbit is a question, that every sunrise, all 16 of them per day, is an invitation to see something we have never seen before. And that is what makes this story worth telling. Not the mystery for its own sake, but the mystery as a mirror. When astronauts look out into the darkness and feel something looking back, they are experiencing what every human being has felt at some point in their lives, standing under a starry sky on a quiet night, in a forest at dusk, beside an ocean so vast it swallows the horizon. The feeling that we are not alone. Not because something is hiding out there, but because we are creatures built to connect, built to search, built to wonder. Space exploration has always been about more than technology. It has always been about the question beneath the question. Why are we here? What is out there? And are those two questions secretly the same? The International Space Station, that extraordinary collaboration between 16 nations, a laboratory and a home and a cathedral of human ambition, orbiting silently above our heads right now as you listen to these words, is not just a platform for experiments. It is a place where human beings come face to face with the universe and with themselves. And sometimes, in that confrontation, they encounter things they cannot name. Things that live in the space between what we know and what we feel. Things that remind us that the greatest discoveries are not always the ones we can measure. Sometimes the greatest discoveries are the ones that change how we see. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, if it made you look up at the sky tonight with even a slightly different sense of wonder, then it did exactly what I hoped it would. The universe does not owe us answers, but it never stops offering us questions. And the best thing we can do, the most human thing we can do, is keep asking them. If you want to keep exploring these questions with me, if you want to dive deeper into the science of space, the mysteries of the cosmos, and the incredible stories of the people who risk everything to push the boundaries of what we know, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new journey. Leave a comment below telling me what you think the watchers really are, or share your own experience of looking up at the night sky and feeling something you could not quite explain. I read every comment, and your perspective matters. Hit that like button if this video moved you, and share it with someone who loves looking at the stars. Because these conversations, these questions, these moments of shared